Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take core material that you've been studying, maybe wrestling with, and to really dig in, not just to summarize the facts, but to find the truths that offer genuine wisdom and transformation. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a source that focuses on one of the most remarkable and I think challenging narratives in the Old Testament, the account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego preserved for us in Daniel chapter 3.
And it is a story that, for so many of us, we associated with our early Sunday school lessons. It's often illustrated, for children. But the source material we're looking at, it correctly elevates it far beyond a simple childhood tale of a dramatic rescue.
Right.
It's treated as a serious historical record and, maybe more importantly, as a profound theological picture of what enduring, uncompromising faith really looks like when it's faced with that life or death pressure.
That distinction is so vital, isn't it? Moving past just the spectacle to get to the substance. Because the danger of reducing this to just a dramatic rescue is that we miss the profound challenge and, the deep comfort it offers to every thoughtful adult believer today, especially when we face our own demands for compromise, which might be subtle or sometimes not so subtle.
Absolutely. So our mission for this deep dive is, well, it's to go deep. We want to extract the essence of what it means to uphold that kind of uncompromising loyalty, and also to find the assurance of God's relentless presence when the heat, so to speak, is turned up in our own lives. We aren't just recounting the event. We're really trying to analyze what it means to be delivered. And this is a key distinction, not necessarily from the fire, but to be faithfully sustained through it.
That's such a crucial frame. Because if the goal is spiritual maturity, then the challenge isn't really about avoiding the fire, is it? It's about learning how to walk in it. Okay, let's unpack this. We'll start by thoroughly grounding ourselves in the intense historical context of the Babylonian exile. It's so important. Then we'll trace the narrative of their uncompromising stand. After that, we'll analyze the powerful theological significance of that choice, and finally we'll look at the very practical and often uncomfortable application for us, for the believer navigating compromise in the modern world. To really appreciate the courage of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we have to set the stage. We're in the Babylonian exile. This is a time when Judah has been decisively conquered, Jerusalem, the temple, they're in ruins. Outwardly, it looks like all the covenant promises are just shattered by military defeat.
And Yahweh's power, from a purely human perspective, seems secondary to the might of Nebuchadnezzar. And the source material is very clear that this captivity, this exile, it wasn't disorganized. It was a calculated, very strategic process.
How so?
Well, the exiles that were chosen for court service weren't random. They were specifically identified as the brightest young men. So you're talking about the elite, the intelligent, the ones who were destined for future leadership roles back in Judah. They were brought to Babylon for a very specific reason.
They represented the future of the nation that had just been conquered.
Exactly. So this wasn't just relocation. It was about integrating the intellectual capital it defeated into the victor's administrative machine. It's a sophisticated form of psychological warfare against their whole national identity.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
It was a deliberate, long-term process of assimilation and erasure. I mean, think about it. If you take the elite, you indoctrinate them thoroughly, you convert them to your way of thinking and your loyalties, you effectively dismantle the intellectual and spiritual identity of the entire nation they're supposed to lead. And you do it without firing another shot.
The Babylonians needed these men to become Babylonian, functionally, intellectually, and spiritually.
And the most explicit, sort of aggressive first step in that whole process was changing their names.
We gloss over that detail so easily, don't we? But the source really emphasizes this as a critical act of spiritual conquest.
Oh, it was profound. It was an act of dehumanization and reorientation. Their original Hebrew names were deeply covenantal. They connected them directly to the God of Israel.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Hananiah meant Yahweh is gracious. Mishael was a question, who is like God? And Azariah meant Yahweh has helped. These names were like miniature theological statements. They tethered these young men to their history, to the law, to the promises of their covenant God. Every single time their name was called, they were reminded of Yahweh.
That their new names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were specifically designed to strip that identity away.
Yes, and replace it with allegiance to the gods of Babylon. It was a total replacement.
So they were replacing Yahweh with pagan deities.
Exactly. I mean, the source notes Daniel's new name, Belteshazzar, honored Bel, who was the supreme Babylonian deity, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They got titles that conceptually honored Babylonian gods of light and fire. This was so much more than a bureaucratic change. It was an attempt to reshape their inner loyalties, to force them to spiritually pledge allegiance to the empire. They were trying to manufacture spiritual puppets of the king.
Which emphasizes how foundational this struggle was. It
Yeah.
started long before the furnace ever appeared. Their identity was already being contested. Now, let's look at the political stage. Babylon was the most dominant empire of its age. Nebuchadnezzar ruled with absolute, unchallenged authority. So what was the significance of this golden image he builds on the plain of Dura?
It was a declaration. It was not a decoration. This wasn't some modest shrine tucked away in a corner. It was enormous. A monumental golden structure, probably over 90 feet high, designed specifically to impress and to intimidate.
And its purpose was twofold, right?
Mhm.
Political and religious.
That's right. Politically, it was meant to symbolize Nebuchadnezzar's power, maybe even his own divinity. And religiously, it demanded universal, explicit loyalty from all officials and all conquered peoples in his vast, diverse empire.
So the decree was that when this massive state orchestra played, the sound of the horn, the zither, the harp, everyone, regardless of their background or their previous faith, had to bow down.
It was a comprehensive loyalty test, a mandatory act of political submission wrapped up in religious ceremony. If you bowed, you were acknowledging the supremacy of Babylon and, by extension, the absolute authority of King Nebuchadnezzar as the source of all power.
And this creates the impossible dilemma for the Jewish exiles. For
Right.
them, this command didn't just infringe on their beliefs, it struck right at the heart of their covenant relationship with God.
At the first two commandments,
Yeah.
specifically,
It's-
it was a clean contradiction. I mean, the covenant demanded exclusive worship of Yahweh, no other gods, no graven images. The law was non-negotiable on this point. So to bow before that statue was, in their eyes, spiritual adultery. It was a breach of their most foundational commitment.
But to refuse was to defy the most powerful ruler on earth.
And guarantee a swift, public, and horrific death.
That tension, it just elevates the refusal, doesn't it? It wasn't stubbornness. It was an act of profound theological fidelity.
That is the essential takeaway from this section. Their refusal was a declaration that their covenant with God was heavier, more serious, and more binding than the totality of earthly power and the overwhelming threat of execution. They had already resisted the assimilation of the name change. This was the final lethal test. They understood the choice was lethal, but they chose covenant over convenience.
So the stage is set with maximum tension. The music begins, this anthem of domination, and across the plain of Dura, everyone bows. But three men who had already been assimilated into court life stood upright. Their defiance was immediate, public, and just impossible to overlook in that huge crowd of officials.
And their visible refusal immediately created a political crisis for Nebuchadnezzar. And it's interesting, as the source notes, the accusation didn't come from the king's top advisors. It came from rival Chaldean officials.
That's such an important detail for today, isn't it? That often the fiercest persecution comes from jealous peers.
Yes, people looking to exploit another's obedience for their own professional gain. And they slandered the three men. They twisted their refusal to bow into an act of personal, treasonous rebellion against the king.
Nebuchadnezzar's reaction is rage, which is natural given his absolute authority and his ego. But he pauses. He summons them and gives them a second, final offer. Why do you think he paused? The death sentence was already decreed. Why not just execute them instantly?
Well, it speaks to the psychology of absolute power, doesn't it? Nebuchadnezzar didn't want martyrs. He wanted total submission. And execution is a sign of failure, in a way. It means he hadn't fully broken their spirit.
That makes sense.
If he could compel them to publicly recant and submit, that would be a much more powerful symbol of his absolute control. It would reinforce loyalty across the entire empire. So this final offer, it wasn't mercy. It was a desperate attempt to maintain his image as the undisputed sovereign who could break even the most resolute spirit.
And his hubris, his arrogance just peaks right here. It's perfectly articulated in that taunt from Daniel 3.15. What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?
That sentence is the absolute flashpoint of this entire narrative. I mean, it is human arrogance confronting divine sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar genuinely believed he had already defeated Yahweh when he sacked Jerusalem and looted the temple. He was challenging the God of Israel to a direct contest right then and there, betting on his imperial power over any divine intervention.
And that context just magnifies the stunning, quiet courage in their response.
It really does.
And that response, Daniel 3 verses 17 and 18, is what defines this deep dive. It's the gold standard for declarations of faith. Let's spend some time on this because it's often quoted, but rarely fully excavated.
We have to break those worlds down because their structure is just perfection. Their declaration has three powerful, distinct truths. First, they begin with an unwavering confession of God's capacity. The God we serve is able to deliver us from it. There's zero doubt in their minds about God's power. They fully acknowledge his sovereignty, his ability to intervene.
And second, they establish a firm hope that he might, or maybe even will, deliver them from the king's hand and from the flames. They express an expectation that's born from their covenant knowledge.
Exactly. But it's the third clause, that final decisive statement, that transforms their declaration from just confidence and power to the ultimate display of discipleship, the even-if clause.
But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up.
That phrase, even if he does not, that is the definition of unconditional loyalty. It strips away every transactional element from their faith.
It's not a negotiation.
Not at all. Their loyalty was not conditional upon a specific favorable outcome, in this case, a miraculous physical escape. Their faithfulness was rooted entirely in their conviction about God's character and their obedience to his command, independent of whether they survived or not. They weren't making a bargain saying, we will obey you if you promise to save us. They were declaring, we will obey you because you are God, and your worthiness and our obligation to you are independent of whether we live or die today.
This moves their faith past simple trust and into something more, like radical, committed devotion. It's a faith that understands that if they die, they win eternal gain, and if they live, they get to witness God's power. There's no losing scenario for them.
The source material is so right to call this the heart of true discipleship. Conditional faith, which is so common today, says, I'll serve you as long as you keep me healthy, wealthy, and comfortable. But unconditional, even if faith says, I will serve you because you commanded it, and my life is already yours, whether I face the furnace or the palace. This level of commitment is what the world just finds baffling.
And given the king's enormous ego and his direct challenge to their God, their quiet refusal must have been utterly infuriating for him. So how did Nebuchadnezzar handle this stunning public humiliation?
The text says he went beyond just rage. His face was distorted with fury. The challenge he threw at God had been instantly answered by these three young men, and he had lost control of the situation. He couldn't afford to look weak. So to compensate for this humiliation and to make an unmistakable example of them, he gives the order. Heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual.
That detail about 7 times hotter, it's crucial to the integrity of the narrative, isn't it?
It is absolutely essential. It proves 2 things. First, the extreme severity of the king's madness and his lethal intent. And second, the utter impossibility of human survival. The intensity of the heat was so profound that the elite soldiers, the mighty men who were tasked with carrying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the opening, were killed by the radiant heat alone.
Wow.
So the fire was established, without a shadow of a doubt, as a place where life could not survive.
So the 3 men, still bound by ropes, are thrown into this hyper-intense inferno, and yet the narrative immediately shifts to Nebuchadnezzar's astonishment. What exactly did the king see that made him rise in haste and turn to his advisors?
He was watching the execution, expecting a swift, incineration, but instead he saw 3 distinct figures walking around unbound in the middle of the flames.
Unbound.
Unbound. The flames had been lethal to the soldiers, but for the believers, the fire acted surgically. It burned away the ropes, the symbols of their captivity and their doom, but it left the men completely unharmed.
And then the appearance of the 4th figure, the one the king himself describes with awe. The form of the 4th is like a son of the gods.
This is the pinnacle of the miracle, and it's a major point of theological discussion in the source material we're looking at. This figure symbolized God's undeniable, active, personal presence. And this is where we need to address the nuance of who this 4th figure was. The source notes that commentators debate whether this was an angel or a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ.
Why do scholars lean toward the idea that it might be more than just an angel? What detail pushes that interpretation?
Well, those who argue for a Christopho, the pre-incarnate Christ, often point specifically to Nebuchadnezzar's reaction, his phrase, like a son of the gods. Now, while son of the gods is a pagan description, it carries a weight suggesting a divine quality beyond what you'd usually attribute to a created angelic messenger. And furthermore, just the magnitude of the miracle, manifesting God's protection at this critical juncture in salvation history, when the covenant line seemed most threatened, it suggests the highest possible level of intervention. The argument is that only the presence of the Lord himself was sufficient to render the power of death entirely inert.
But regardless of the specific identity, the theological message remains incredibly powerful and clear. When God's people stand firm, God steps into the trial with them. The furnace ceases to be a place of execution, and it becomes a sanctuary.
Precisely. God does not necessarily promise that we will avoid the fire, but he promises that we will not face it alone. His presence sustains them through the fire, rendering the flames powerless against them. It transforms the place of suffering into a place of profound communion.
The conclusion of the narrative is just astonishing. Nebuchadnezzar calls them out, and they emerge completely unharmed. But the source emphasizes a truly remarkable detail. Not only was not a hair singed, their clothing was unchanged, but there was not even the smell of smoke on them.
That small, often overlooked detail is so powerful. It emphasizes the totality of God's protection. I mean, if you just walk near a fire, you smell like smoke. If you were in the fire, the odor would cling to you. The absence of the smell means the fire didn't just fail to harm them, it failed to even touch them in any way that lingered. This detail removes all possibility of some human explanation or natural chance. The miracle was absolute.
And the result of this absolute preservation is the king's forced confession. The man who had challenged God's ability to rescue was forced to reverse his own decree and acknowledge divine power over his own.
He was compelled to bless Yahweh and declare, "No other God can save in this way." And that is the power of unyielding faithfulness. It silenced the accusers, it demonstrated God's absolute sovereignty over the mightiest earthly empire, and it caused the most arrogant ruler to submit, at least for a moment, to the supremacy of Yahweh. The trial became the most profound testimony possible.
So, we've explored the immense stakes of the context and the incredible reality of the miracle. Let's now transition to the deeper meaning. The source material instructs us that the story is far more than a historical spectacle. It contains these enduring truths about the nature of our discipleship. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what are the central lessons here?
I think we can identify 4 foundational theological lessons, and the first one is the primacy of obedience over compromise.
Obedience seems simple on the surface, but in this case, it meant instant death. So how does their refusal to bow define what true obedience is?
Their refusal was the ultimate declaration that God's law, his revealed truth, specifically the prohibition against idolatry, it occupies a higher jurisdiction than the decrees of any earthly ruler, any government, or any cultural consensus. They knew they served a king higher than Nebuchadnezzar.
Not at all. It would have been so convenient to just bow quickly, rationalize it as temporary submission to save their lives,
Yeah.
and then, go back to serving Yahweh in private. But they understood that compromise on core truth, even under that kind of threat, is still disobedience.
Exactly. The line between external compliance and internal conviction is often blurred in modern life, but for them, that line was absolute. They show that true conviction demands public, uncompromising loyalty, even when the cost is literally everything. It's a severe check against our pervasive temptation to find some middle ground when core biblical truths are challenged.
And this brings us right back to that crucial second point, which we've labeled modeling even if faith. This concept needs full excavation. What are the costs and implications of this kind of unconditional trust?
The even if faith is really the hallmark of profound spiritual maturity because it handles the deepest spiritual conflict, the conflict between believing God can and submitting if God doesn't. It means their trust did not rely on immediate physical delivery. They submitted completely to God's will, even if that will meant martyrdom.
But that's a heavy demand. What are the psychological hurdles to achieving that level of unconditional trust? I mean, for most of us, trust is tied to perceived outcomes. If I pray for healing and God heals, my faith grows. If I pray and the situation worsens, doubt can set in.
And that's the critical difference between conditional faith and even if faith. Conditional faith views God as a means to an end, sort of a cosmic vending machine for preferred outcomes. Even if faith shifts the focus entirely from the outcome to the character of God, the psychological hurdle is surrendering that human need for control and for understanding. We have to trust that God is entirely good, entirely sovereign, and entirely faithful, even if we don't understand his specific plan for our suffering. It requires a radical shift in perspective.
Acknowledging that our immediate comfort is secondary to his eternal glory and purpose.
Yes.
And the source material draws a powerful connection between this Old Testament declaration and the New Testament. It connects this mindset directly to Paul's declaration in Philippians 1:21, to live is Christ and to die is gain.
And this connection, it just beautifully demonstrates the consistency of God's demands across millennia. The even-if mindset is foundational to Christian discipleship. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if the fire consumed them, they were faithful martyrs who gained immediate eternal fellowship. If the fire preserved them, they were undeniable witnesses to God's power. There was no true loss for them, only gain.
So their trust redefined risk. They understood that the existential risk was displeasing God, not losing their earthly lives.
Exactly. The source suggests that this spiritual calculus must govern all of our decisions. When we genuinely adopt the posture that death is gain, because it means perfected fellowship with Christ, then the world loses its leverage over us. The threat of the furnace or the threat of modern social exclusion, it just can't compel us to sin.
Which leads to the third point, and this is perhaps the greatest comfort we can derive from the narrative, the reality of God's presence in trial, symbolized by that fourth figure.
This point moves the story from being a call to courage to being an assurance of divine fellowship. The fourth figure assures us that God does not abandon his people when the trials hit their peak, and we have to emphasize the nature of that deliverance. God did not take them out of the furnace before they were thrown in. He walked into the furnace with them.
So the fire was allowed to burn, but its destructive power was neutralized by God's presence.
It transformed the very nature of the trial. The fire became a refining agent, not a consuming one. As we noted, it burned away the ropes, the external shackles, while preserving the very essence of the believer. God's presence sustained them through the trauma, making the hottest moment of their life the most intimate moment of communion they could ever experience.
That shifts the focus dramatically. The prayer becomes less about, God, please take this away, and more about, God, sustain me and walk with me through this.
That is the pastoral application right there. The trial, when it's endured with God's presence, becomes a place of spiritual formation and profound witness, not a place of abandonment or failure.
And finally, point 4, witness to the nations. This seems to be the ultimate, overarching goal of the entire incident from the perspective of the divine plan.
It absolutely is. God consistently uses the steadfastness and the subsequent deliverance of his people as a public, undeniable witness to the wider world. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, who had defied and belittled Yahweh, was forced to issue a decree acknowledging his supremacy. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout all of Scripture.
So their faithfulness became the megaphone for God's glory.
Yes. Our refusal to compromise, when it's done publicly and with integrity, it turns into the headline testimony for the world. It proves that there's a power greater than the empire, greater than the cultural pressure, and greater than the fear of death. Their deliverance didn't just save them, it changed the political and spiritual climate of Babylon.
We've established the historical weight and the deep theological framework. Now let's bring this right into the listener's daily life. The source material asserts that the fiery furnace isn't just an ancient story. It's a mirror reflecting the trials we face today that demand compromise. The golden statue is gone, but the idols are different and, just as real.
The fundamental conflict is identical. Will we choose the temporary comfort, or the acceptance or the profit offered by the world's current power structures, or will we choose uncompromising loyalty to the unseen God? The context changes. It's no longer the threat of a physical furnace, but the spiritual temperature remains dangerously high.
The source identifies 3 key modern idols. Let's expand on them. First, the idol of wealth. If that gold statue symbolized loyalty to the Babylonian economic machine, how does the idol of wealth manifest today?
Today, the idol of wealth pressures us to compromise our ethical or spiritual standards for material gain or for professional advancement. Think about the corporate environment.
Right.
The pressure to fudge numbers to hit a quarter's goal, or the temptation to remain silent about a colleague's unethical behavior just to protect your own position.
Or more subtly, even.
Yes, more subtly, it might be the compulsion to constantly prioritize work, the pursuit of wealth or status over spiritual commitments, Sabbath rest, or family obligations. Every hour spent chasing money that should have been spent honoring God is a subtle bow to that idol.
And the second idol, cultural approval. This one seems to be the most pervasive pressure point in the West today.
Absolutely. The idol of cultural approval is the pressure to surrender biblical truths, especially concerning human identity, morality, or justice, simply to fit in with prevailing social norms. The furnace today often involves social ridicule, marginalization on social media, or professional exclusion. To stand firm in biblical conviction in the public square, to articulate a view that contradicts the popular narrative, that is to invite the heat.
Can you give us a specific, realistic example of what that confrontation might look like?
Sure. Think about a highly public setting. maybe a professional conference or university discussion, where a fundamental biblical truth, say the definition of marriage or the sanctity of life, is actively mocked or dismissed. The temptation is to perform a kind of social bow, to remain utterly silent, maybe to nod along, or even to issue a vague, non-committal statement to signal alignment, just to preserve your reputation and avoid conflict.
And the three men remind us that silence in the face of idolatry is a form of submission.
It is. And finally, the idol of
How
self-indulgence.
so?
This is the quietest but perhaps most personally devastating compromise. It's the constant temptation to choose immediate gratification and personal pleasure over spiritual discipline and holiness. It's the compromise of discipline in our private spaces, whether that is time management, viewing habits, or what we consume. It's prioritizing what we want right now over what God has called us to be. Every day presents countless opportunities to bow the knee to self, the ultimate small god of our age.
Let's talk about the challenge to resist compromise, specifically within the church context. The source material discusses false teaching and diluted doctrine.
This is such a crucial application for thoughtful adults. Within the visible church today, we often see core doctrines challenged or diluted under the banner of peace or progress or relevance. When core biblical truths, the inerrancy of Scripture, the necessity of repentance, the exclusivity of Christ, when those are softened to appease contemporary culture, there is a strong temptation for leaders and members to just remain silent. They fear conflict, division, or alienation from the surrounding community.
And the source material argues that remaining silent in the face of this internal compromise is a different form of bowing, maybe even more damaging than external persecution.
It is a devastating compromise because it sacrifices truth for a temporary unity or comfort. True faithfulness demands that we earnestly contend for the truth, even when doing so costs us reputation or relationships within our own Christian community. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't just passively refuse, they actively and publicly refused, knowing the monumental cost. Our obedience has to be active, which means speaking truth when doctrine is diluted, even if it feels like stepping into a social furnace.
This raises a very honest and sincere question that I think a lot of listeners grapple with in our pluralistic, polarized society. Where does the necessity for standing firm on conviction clash with the imperative for grace, kindness, and peace? How does a believer draw that line and communicate it lovingly but firmly?
That is a tremendously difficult question, and the answer is not simple, but it starts with identifying what is core and what is peripheral. The three men were asked to violate the two most fundamental commandments. When the command of the culture or the pressure of this system forces a direct contradiction of God's clearly revealed law, the non-negotiable standards of Scripture, that is the moment we must stand. That is the line of compromise.
But how do we communicate that without sounding angry or judgmental, which so often happens in the current public discourse?
We have to execute that refusal with conviction and clarity, but always framed by love and humility. Our focus should be on expressing loyalty to God, not on condemning others. We must clearly articulate what we cannot do. We cannot bow to this idol. And why? Because we belong to a higher king. We defend the truth by living it uncompromisingly, and we speak it in a way that respects the person, even as we refuse the ideology. This requires profound self-control. It's the difference between standing firm because we are afraid of God's displeasure and standing firm because we love and honor Him above all others.
Now, let's detail the challenge in the broader societal context. When a believer takes a stand, the consequences today are typically ridicule, economic marginalization, or pressure to conform in the workplace.
That is the modern heat we face. The temptation to avoid conflict, to simply fly under the radar, is so strong. Yet, the example of the three men reminds us forcefully that God honors those who honor Him publicly. Our calling is steadfast obedience, period. It's not about negotiating a way to win favor with men while maintaining a private semblance of faith. We are called to fidelity, not to popularity contests with the world.
And this application leads us directly to the personal, often solitary daily trials we all face, the ultimate fiery furnaces of our individual lives.
Every Christian will encounter these personal furnaces. The illness that doesn't heal, the job loss that devastates finances, the loss of a loved one, chronic disappointment, or the relentless private attacks of temptation. These are the moments that truly test the depth of the faith and conviction we profess. If we have only practiced conditional faith, faith based on pleasant outcomes, these unexpected trials will shatter us.
But if we have built the muscle of even if faith in the small moments of obedience, how does that translate into facing profound hardship?
Then it becomes a practical, life-saving reality. We can affirm, as those three men did, that God is fully able to deliver us from this illness or retrieve us from this loss. But even if he chooses not to, if he allows the loss to remain or the illness to progress, we know his character is unchanged and we remain loyal. God may deliver us miraculously, as he did in Babylon, or he may allow us to endure the hardship for his greater purposes, to refine our character, to deepen our reliance on him, or to provide a stronger witness of Christ's sufficiency.
And the conclusion is always the same. In both scenarios, whether we are delivered from or sustained through, his presence is sufficient and his glory is ultimately revealed in the process.
Yes. The overarching spiritual lesson is that genuine faith is fundamentally defined by our trust in God's unwavering character. His goodness, his wisdom, his love, not by the quality or comfort of the circumstances we find ourselves in. Their story stands as a beacon, encouraging us to stand firm in the truth, resist the idols of our age, and believe with absolute certainty that God is utterly with us through every trial.
This deep dive has stripped away the familiarity of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I think revealed a profound, challenging, and comforting testimony for the adult believer. It reminds us that conviction must define our faith, not convenience, and that the assurance of God's presence is our greatest comfort when the world demands compromise.
They teach us that when the world demands compromise on core truth, the faithful response is non-negotiable obedience, regardless of the cost. Their refusal to bow, their declarations of even if faith, and their miraculous preservation demonstrate that God's people are never alone, even in the hottest place the world can throw them.
So, what does this all mean for us today? It means the God who appeared in the fire for 3 Hebrew exiles is the same God who walks with us through our most intense modern trials. He is present in the boardroom, in the hospital room, and in the private struggle.
And this brings us back so powerfully to the closing scripture referenced in our source material.
Okay.
A passage from Isaiah, written decades before this event ever happened, yet it perfectly echoes their experience. It's Isaiah 43, verse 2, where God addresses his people. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze.
That is the essential encouragement, isn't it? This is not necessarily a promise of prevention from the trial. We are told we will walk through the fire, but it is an absolute covenantal promise of preservation and sustaining presence within it. The fire will not consume us if God is with us. It reminds us that God is present, faithful to sustain, and mighty to deliver, turning our trials into undeniable, fragrant testimonies of his power.
May you find the courage today to stand firm in your deepest convictions, recognizing that true loyalty is unconditional, and knowing that whatever fire you face, of exclusion, illness, or temptation, his sustaining presence is sufficient, and the flames will not set you ablaze.